Good morning. I'm Scott Walston, President and Senior Fellow at the Technology Policy Institute. Welcome to the 11th annual, but first virtual, TPI Aspen Forum. We've got a great week lined up for you with interesting panels and speakers. The days are more or less focused on different themes. After an opening talk on innovation, today we're focused on privacy, tomorrow on competition and antitrust, Wednesday on China, Thursday on broadband and the digital divide, and Friday on media. I'd like to thank our donors for their support. We're always grateful, but particularly in these times when resources are more scarce, we feel especially grateful to them. Let me tell you some details about how you can best engage with everyone at this week's virtual forum. The main loss from not being together in person, aside from simply not being in beautiful Aspen, Colorado, is the difficulty of networking, seeing friends, and making new ones. We're hoping to overcome that challenge by using a site called GatherTown, in which we've built a two-dimensional virtual version of the Aspen St. Regis Hotel, where we normally hold the conference, Aspen's main pedestrian street, and a few other places like Maroon Bells. You can walk around in that virtual world and interact with people the same way you would in real life. You should have instructions for how to get there in the information we sent you. It's open all week, 24 hours a day, but we are particularly hoping that you will go there during lunch and for happy hours and tonight's trivia contest. And like any good conference, if you're awake in the middle of the night, you can head down to the bar and see who else is around. We are using a service called Slido to take questions from the audience for the live Q&A sessions. If you've been with us in Aspen in the past, then you're familiar with it. To use it, in a separate browser window or on your phone, not in Zoom, go to Slido, sli.do. In the event code, type TPI Aspen 2020. The moderator and panelists will see those questions and hopefully answer them. Please start typing in questions as soon as you have one. There's no reason to wait until the actual Q&A session starts to ask a question. Now, we're going to kick off our Monday panels with a special conversation with Matt Ridley about his new book, How Innovation Works and Why It Flourishes in Freedom. TPI Distinguished Senior Fellow Bob Hahn will lead the discussion and take questions from the audience. After that talk, we'll move on to today's sessions on privacy.
We're delighted to kick off TPI's virtual Aspen Forum by talking with best-selling author and UK House of Lords member, Matt Ridley. I'm going to say a couple words about Matt, and then we're going to launch into our discussion. Dr. Ridley holds a BA and DPhil from Oxford University, where in the interest of full disclosure, I still have an affiliation there. He worked for my favorite periodical in the world, The Economist, for about 9 years as science editor, Washington correspondent, and American editor. He has more distinguished awards and publications than I could possibly review in the 30 or 40 minutes that we have, but I will nevertheless mention a few. He won the Hayek Prize in 2011, the Julian Simon Award in 2012, and the Free Enterprise Award from the Institute for Economic Affairs in 2014. He's a fellow of the Royal Society of Literature and of the Academy of Medical Sciences. He's also a foreign honorary member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. Matt's TED Talk, When Ideas Have Sex. Yes, people can have sex, animals can have sex, and evidently ideas can as well. That TED Talk has been viewed by more than 2 million individuals, or at least it's been downloaded. His many books include one of my favorites, The Rational Optimist, and The Evolution of Everything. So as you can see, Matt takes on very small subject areas. Today, we're going to be discussing his new book, How Innovation Works and Why It Flourishes in Freedom. Matt, welcome and thanks for joining us.
Bob, it's great to be with you today. I'm sorry we're not there in person, but at least we can see each other by the magic of the magic screen.
Very true. So let me start with a simple question, or maybe a simple question, I'm not sure. So when I think of innovation, I think of the idea of building a better mousetrap. I don't know if they still make mousetraps these days, but that's what I think of. It used to be a phrase. How do you think of innovation, and what motivated you to write this book?
Well, I think somebody once said that if you build a better mousetrap, the world will be to path to your door, or something like that. And I think that's not right. I think there's a lot of work between the first prototype of your better mousetrap and it becoming a widely adopted, reliable, affordable, and available device. And that's what I call innovation. So I think innovation is more than just invention. It's also turning inventions into things that are actually useful to people and reliable and affordable. And that's much harder work than we often give it credit for. So we tend to praise inventors and tell stories about how they had the idea very suddenly, whereas in fact those stories are often made up after the event. But then we forget to talk about the people who helped them turn those ideas into really useful things. And that's very hard work, and it's a somewhat different process. It's a much more collaborative process, and so on. So that's really what I'm getting at in using the word innovation, is the distinction between the prototype and the practical device.
Got it. In the introduction to your book, you take a very polite, might I say, British swipe at the social science community. You say that no economist or social scientist can fully explain why innovation happens. I guess my question is, why is that? Is it just a very difficult process to understand, or is it that economists have been lazy or sort of undervalue the importance of it, or what?
Well, I think it's very interesting that if you look at economic theory, it had no explanation for innovation for a very long time. And arguably, it still hasn't. It's got Paul Romer's idea about endogenous growth, which is essentially about how innovation is a product. But go back 40 or 50 years, innovation is like manna from heaven. It dribbles down onto the planet and we make use of it. But it doesn't pop out of the equations, as it were. And if you go right back to Adam Smith, he's talking about the innovation that drives improvements in the pin factory, but he's also talking about the equilibrium we try to reach in our dealings with the baker, the butcher, and the brewer. And an equilibrium, by definition, is not an innovation. It's diminishing returns, whereas innovation delivers increasing returns. And that paradox, I think, and I rely on a very, very good book called Knowledge and the Wealth of Nations by David Walsh here. That paradox has bedeviled economic theory for a long time and left us without really a very good understanding. We got a huge understanding of the importance of innovation from Schumpeter onwards in economics, but I don't think we've got a full understanding of why it happens, when and where it does. And indeed, to some extent, although I have had a crack at explaining this myself, why it happens to us and not to rabbits or rocks.
All right, let me you use the word dribble, and one of the key takeaways that I gleaned from your book was that you think of this innovation idea as a gradual process. But when I think of innovation based on commercials I see on TV or what I learned in elementary school, I sort of think of Thomas Edison, the light bulb goes on. So what's wrong with my model?
Yeah, I think this is a really important point because, sure, innovation can be disruptive. It arrives and it suddenly changes your life. One day you don't have a mobile phone, next day you do. One day the world has never seen powered flight, the next day it has, and so on. But if you examine more closely what's happened in the weeks, months, and years before that breakthrough, there has been a very gradual build-up to that point, involving lots of different people, building on their ideas, and so on. And the more you take one of these sudden breakthrough moments and examine it in detail, the more you find that it's somewhat gradual. The best example of this, I think, is Moore's law, which is the description of the improvement in computing over time. And Gordon Moore spotted that there was a regular, steady improvement in the amount of computing you could buy for a given sum of money in the early 1960s. His law was still holding true 40 or 50 years later. And yet, the fact that we knew his rule didn't enable us to cheat his rule. didn't enable us to say, well, look, if we're going to get to such and such a chip in the year 2000, why don't we jump ahead and do it now? So it's surprisingly sort of gradual, incremental, inevitable, inexorable, if you like, the progress of a technology. But it does, and it results in very big changes in society. But it is actually a somewhat gradual process. There's a consequence of this, which I quite like, which is that innovations tend to creep up on us. You invent something, there's a lot of work goes into it. It doesn't change the world. You even have some articles in the newspapers saying, well, that was a bit disappointing. Where's the impact on the world from that invention we heard so much about, genomics or graphene or something like that? And then suddenly it does change the world. And that there's some kind of tipping point is reached when it becomes universally available and suddenly we all hear about it and we all want it. But that's more to do with the take-up of the innovation rather than the making of the innovation.
So are you saying it's wrong to sort of think of these focal points, some of which you talk about in your book, like the steam engine or Edison, or one of my favorites, which I'll ask you to opine on, which was, why did it take so long to put wheels on suitcases or something like that? You may have had slightly different words about that. But so why do we sort of focus on these events? Why was I taught about this that way? Was it because people really didn't have an understanding of that process, or do we have a need to sort of highlight certain figures throughout history? And then maybe you can opine on this very important subject of wheels on suitcases.
Yeah, well, we like to tell stories and we like to hear stories, and the stories should be about people. And actually, that's why in my book, I start by telling a bunch of stories about innovations. But once you examine those stories, you find that they have tended to overemphasize the role of one individual rather than others. Edison's light bulb is a very nice example of this. Edison did invent a very effective and reliable light bulb, but so did 20 other people around the same time in different parts of the world. Where I live in the northeast of England, there was a guy called Joseph Swan who actually ended up going into business with Edison. In Russia, there was a chap called Lodygin, and so on. So there was something inevitable about light bulbs getting invented when they did, just as there was something inevitable about search engines getting invented in the early 1990s, if you like, when Google was formed. But the idea that somebody jumps out of his bath and runs down the street shouting Eureka, which is where the Eureka moment comes from, because that's what Archimedes supposedly did, is nearly always made up in retrospect. I write in the book about a wonderful guy called Malcolm McLean who invented container shipping effectively, or innovated container shipping. He sort of forced the world to adopt standardized containers that could go on ships and also on the backs of trucks, which transformed global trade, a hugely important innovation. Not much of an invention, but a very important innovation. And he is bedeviled by a story that he had the idea while he was waiting in a very long line of trucks for dockers to unload the trucks into ships. And he suddenly had this idea that it would be, easier to not break the bulk and just put the whole container on the ship. And, there's this specific story about him that gets told in the textbooks. And he says, it's just not true. People made this up after the event. And his biographer said, it's extraordinary how hard it is to kill this story. It's out there. People want to tell it. So to some extent, I'm debunking those stories. And partly one of my motives in doing so, apart from just being a spoilsport, is that I think there's a tendency to talk about invention and innovation as if it's something that only special people can do. That you have to have this magic juice inside you called creativity. And if you didn't get taught that at school, you're hopeless. And I don't think that's true. If you look at these great innovators, they were people who just worked harder at it, tried more trial and error experiments, picked themselves off the floor when things went wrong and tried again. There's a wonderful phrase about the Wright brothers from the man who took the photograph of them taking off in December 1903, and he said they were the workingest boys I ever saw. And that's a lovely description. So all you got to do is work hard, be open-minded, do trial and error, fail fast and often, and you can be a great innovator too.
Great. So both of us being affiliated with Oxford in some way, I feel like I want to press you on this and bring up a book which I'm sure you've thought about, which is Thomas Kuhn's The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, where I think the argument was, I read the book a long time ago, but where I think the argument was, we sort of have one framework for seeing the world, or one paradigm for seeing the world, and then something comes along, anomalies come along, and our paradigm sort of suddenly shifts. So I'm wondering, I guess, a couple of things. One, in our conversation, you said, you made really 2 points. One is that innovation may be gradual or continuous, and I don't mean to put words in your mouth, but that's what I think you said. And the second point you made was one that reminded me of Kuhn, which was when Edison came along and invented the light bulb, there may have been 10 other people in line that could have just as easily gotten credit for it. I guess my question is, how does your work or your book relate to Kuhn, and what do you think of his argument?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. By the way, I shouldn't forget to come back to wheeled suitcases. Will you remind me to
Okay,
do so?
we can do that.
I failed to answer that point about wheeled suitcases, and it's a lovely question. Thomas Kuhn is writing about scientific theories rather than innovations and technological inventions, and so it's not necessarily the same thing. But of course, there are distinct parallels, and particularly with the adoption of innovations. I write in the book about the invention of vaccination, or inoculation as it was originally called, and particularly about a rather remarkable woman called Lady Mary Wortley Montagu, who was a sort of poet and a society hostess, just survived smallpox, but was terrified that her children were going to die of smallpox. And she went as the ambassador's wife from London to Constantinople in the early 1700s. And there she found, because she was a woman, she was able to mix with the women at the Ottoman emperor's court, and she found that they were deliberately giving their kids small doses of smallpox from somebody who'd survived the disease, and that was rendering them immune. And she said, this is a fascinating idea. She brought it back to the UK, and she persuaded other people, eventually including the Prince of Wales, to do the same to their children. And she was vilified for this. She was extraordinarily unpopular. You know, how dare she do something this ludicrously dangerous? What do you mean? You're deliberately giving a fatal disease to a child. What are you thinking? Well, given that doctors were in the habit of bleeding their patients at that time, you know, it was a bit rich of them to criticize her. But and there's a similar story about the guy who brought it to the US around the same time, who was the slave of a preacher in Boston called Cotton Mather, and his slave was called Onesimus. And he said, look, back in Africa, we do this. And Onesimus persuaded Mather, who persuaded Zabdiel Boylston, who was a doctor, to try this. And Boylston had to go into hiding because the mob was going to kill him for doing this dangerous experiment. So my parallel there with Kuhn is that the heretic who starts a new scientific paradigm is often vilified and persecuted when he starts. I mean, most scientific ideas, you know, think of evolution or whatever, start out by being very unpopular with the majority opinion. And then suddenly the world wakes up. As Max Planck said, it only wakes up when the opponents die. Science advances funeral by funeral, but nonetheless, there is then a sudden change of the world. And vaccination, to me, is quite a nice example of that, because it is a scientific discovery, but it is also a technological invention. And it's one that, by the way, we were doing for hundreds of years before we had the faintest idea of why it worked, before we understood the immune system at all. It's not until Pasteur comes along that we begin to get a glimmering of why vaccination is working.
All right. So I'll give you a chance with the suitcases.
Well, it's a very good question to ask yourself. What can you think of in the way of modern technologies that should have been invented a long time before it was? And it's actually quite hard to come up with a good answer to that question. If you try and think of something that should have been invented 50 years ago and has only just been invented, you usually come up against the problem, well, actually, you couldn't invent it then because you didn't have the other technologies that you need to make it work. And so the kind of obvious one is the wheeled suitcase. And that tells you something because it's the one we all keep coming back to as an example of this. And it's a somewhat trivial one, which perhaps tells you that this is quite a rare phenomenon, that we overlook potential innovations as we move forward as society. But also, I'm not sure it stacks up as an example, because I looked into the history of this. And people have delved into wheeled suitcases when they were first invented and so on. And it's true, there's a guy called Eugene Sado who's going around in the late 1960s, early 1970s, trying to persuade baggage manufacturers to put wheels on suitcases, Samsonite and companies like this. And they're all saying, well, I don't think that's what the market's ready for. And you can have a bit of a laugh about that. But actually, there's a bunch of patents going back to the 1920s for wheels on suitcases. And one of the reasons they didn't catch on was because airports were smaller, or train stations were smaller, porters were commoner, there were more of them, and suitcase wheels would have been heavier and taken up more space. They'd have been made of steel, not plastic, and so on. So actually, maybe the wheeled suitcase comes along at about the right time, perhaps. I have found one very nice example of a very simple technology that should have been invented several thousand years ago and wasn't. It's called the lever axe, and it's a Finnish invention in which you have an asymmetric axe. So as it hits the wood you're splitting, it automatically pushes the wood to one side, so it splits wood much more effectively than a straight axe. You could have invented that at any time since the start of the Iron Age, and you didn't. So there are examples out there, but there are surprisingly few of them. The wheeled suitcase sort of comes along around the right time when we've got huge long airport courses and plastic wheels.
Well, maybe yes, maybe no is my take on that. I would have been happy to have one of those frames that they had, those portable frames that you stick the suitcase on, just because the wheel would have alleviated all the effort that you have to make in schlepping it across the airport.
Yeah, but the porter had that. He had a cart.
That's true. I was just talking about individuals who were taking the stuff. I can remember my dad lugging the suitcases for the 4 of us.
I can remember lugging them myself. Yeah.
Yeah, right. Anyway, you mentioned the word patent when you were talking about the wheeled suitcases, and you talk about patents not always in such a positive context in terms of promoting innovation in your book. And I was just wondering what your take on things like patents and copyright are.
Well, I come down pretty firmly against patents and copyright in the book. What I'm arguing is that they're overdone, that they're too strong, they're too easy to get, they're too defensive, and they're doing more harm than good in most cases. Why do I say that? Well, partly because the empirical evidence suggests that strengthening a patent system doesn't result in more innovation, and weakening a patent system doesn't result in less innovation. Think of music streaming, which is effectively a weakening of the copyright system in music. Has that resulted in people not writing songs? No, it hasn't. Shakespeare operated in a copyright-free world. It didn't put him off writing plays. The other argument is that when patents expire, you see a burst of innovation. You see a release of pent-up innovative energy. So, for example, the expiry of the corrugated iron patent in 1843 led to a sudden rush of new types of corrugated iron and new manufacturers of them, and a very steep fall in the price of it because of competition. The same thing happened with 3D printing just a few years ago, where one of the key patents expired and you saw an explosion of interest. Interestingly, I've just been looking into the history of innovation in Australia, which is not in the book, but it's an essay I've written subsequently. And a bunch of Australian innovators, including a pioneer of flight called Lawrence Hargrave, but also the guy who invented the black box for aircraft, the guy who invented the pacemaker, the medical pacemaker, all three of them very strongly express the opinion that they don't want to patent their devices. They think it's a mistake. The whole point is you should be encouraging the sharing of these ideas, not the protection of these ideas. I think, therefore, there are cultural differences here. America being a much more lawyer-dominated society, if I could put it that way, I think is more in love with patents than the rest of the world. And, you could say I'm being hypocritical here because my books are copyrighted, but that's because the current copyright laws automatically apply for copyright on my behalf as soon as I write them. Mm-hmm. That was a change that was brought in just a few years ago. And they do so for a period of 70 years after my death. You can't rip off my books until my great-grandchildren are under the ground. Well, what on earth's the argument there? Why should they should get a job, my great-grandchildren. They shouldn't be living off my earnings. Not that my earnings are big enough to make a difference to them, you understand. But if I was J.K. Rowling or whatever, they would be. So those are my somewhat cheeky arguments against patents. I can, of course, concede that there are some arguments for them, and it's a finely balanced debate. But that's where I come down.
Right. Probably a little stronger than I would. I think of it as an interior solution that if, you or Josh Lerner or someone like that may be designing if I could use the word optimal patent system for a government, you could probably come up with some property rights protections that give incentives to the innovator and the inventor while not sort of destroying the innovative process. But frequently in the political process, it's not the case that we end up with a system like that.
Yeah, I think that's right. And the growth of the patent troll industry shows essentially, as it were, the misuse of patents rather than necessarily something wrong with the patents themselves. That is to say, companies that buy up patents with no intention of making the product, just with an intention of suing people who trespass on the patent and making money out of the lawsuits or licensing that comes with it. Alex Tabarrok has a nice argument, essentially like the Laffer curve, that a little intellectual property protection is a good thing and a lot is a bad thing, and we need to find a sweet spot in between.
Yeah, that's.
And obviously there is the difficult case of the drug industry having to spend $1 billion proving the safety and efficacy of a drug. And then if someone is able to rip it off as soon as that's happened, then that does not seem fair, and that would be a discouragement. But it's very noticeable how little the digital industry of Silicon Valley has depended on patents over the years.
I agree. A topic for future discussion, I hope. Let me ask you another question or make an observation. So you talk in your book a little bit about nuclear power. And I interviewed a guy named Michael Schellenberger who wrote a book recently about nuclear power as an important way of addressing the issue of climate change and
very good book, Michael's book is,
and raising some of the same issues that you did in your book about the absence or slow rate of innovation in the nuclear area. What's the problem there? And if there is a problem, and is there anything that governments might want to do about it?
Yeah. Well, in the end, it's a problem of misregulation, in my view. That is to say, in regulating for greater and greater safety in nuclear power, we have ended up designing a system of regulation that makes it impossible to innovate. And as a result, we use old-fashioned technologies. We use essentially a not particularly safe technology that was invented in the 1950s. Well, it is safe, but it's not as safe as later iterations would have been, of a pressurized water reactor. So we've not been able to develop saltwater reactors, molten salt reactors, and so on. And the reason for that is because the regulator regulates a new nuclear power. If you apply to build a new nuclear power station, you must get a license. And in both the US and the UK, to get a license requires you to spend an enormous amount of money, take a very long time, and specify very precisely in advance exactly where each nut and bolt is going to be. and then not change your plans halfway through. And that's not how innovation works. Innovation works by saying halfway through the process, you know what, I think there's a better way of doing this. Someone's just invented a better material or whatever it might be. Now, you can see why you don't want to be too experimental in nuclear. We don't want we don't want trial and error in the nuclear industry. But it has resulted in this process. Now, who's reforming that and getting it right? And the answer is Canada. Canada's nuclear regulator is much more technology agnostic, is much more prepared to say, show me how in principle you're going to achieve safety, not how this so they're not regulating the specific technology you're using, they're regulating how safe you're going to make it. And the US nuclear regulator is now trying to work with the Canadian regulator to learn from it how to do it. There are something like 10 different plans in Canada to build molten salt reactors, which is this much smarter design where the fuel is also the coolant and that kind of thing. The reason they're in Canada is purely because the regulator there is more amenable to innovation. So I think that's where the problem lies. If we could get innovation going in the nuclear industry the way we have got it going in the computer industry, then we could drive down costs and drive up safety. I mean, after all, the Fukushima plant was of an old design that should have been mothballed years before, but it was still there because basically no one was wanting to build any new plants because the cost was too high. Actually, I think that's the way to go on nuclear. It's quite a good example of getting regulation, which you think you're doing to make it safe, but you're actually making it slightly less safe because you're preventing innovation happening.
So I have tons of questions I want to ask you, but I'm mindful of our budget constraint that we want to preserve time for Q&A. But one of the things I wanted to ask you to drill down on now, but not spend more than an hour, is why are some societies more innovative than others?
You want that in 1 minute?
Yeah. 10 seconds, go.
The short answer is exchange and freedom. The exchange of ideas, the exchange of goods and services through trade brings together ideas, and innovation is always a process of combining and recombining ideas. And the second point is freedom to fail, freedom to try again, freedom to change your mind, freedom to spot unexpected opportunities, and freedom as the customer to express your wishes. So the very nice case history, I think, is the difference between the Song dynasty in China around 1,000 years ago and the Ming dynasty around 600 years ago. The Song dynasty was very decentralized and merchants were very free, essentially. It was very devolved. Merchants were basically in charge of their own budgets and time. And this was the period that invented gunpowder, the printing press, paper money, and so on. And the Ming dynasty, by contrast, was very centralized, and basically every merchant, every entrepreneur, as we'd call them today, had to get a permission slip from a mandarin in Beijing before he could do anything. It may not have been Beijing, wherever the capital was, I can't remember. And I think that pattern has been replicated again in modern China. So under the Deng Xiaoping compromise that was reached after Mao, for about 30 or 40 years, there was no political freedom in China, but there was considerable economic freedom. If you were an entrepreneur or an innovator, there was very little to stop you. Very few of the petty bureaucratic rules you'd encounter in the West, for example. I think that's changing. Xi Jinping is much more of an economic nationalist and is trying to decide what innovations he wants to happen when and where. And I think that will end in tears. So although China is a very innovative country at the moment, I suspect that won't last. Sorry, that wasn't 1 minute, but
oh, that's okay. I'm glad you said that, because maybe I didn't read your book as closely as I should have, but I thought you were more optimistic about China's prospects for innovating for a while.
I think I probably was in the book, which was finished about a year ago, and I think this dawning realization that they have killed the goose that lays the golden eggs may have come after the book. You're quite right. All
right. So let me finish. So I'm a policy guy as well as an economist. So, you're advising Mr. Trump or Mr. Biden or the next president of the United States, whoever that might be. What are the takeaways based on and they like to talk about innovation and America retaining its competitive edge and all that stuff. What are the key themes that you would emphasize if you had 20 or 30 minutes with them in a room, or 2 minutes with me now, that they should take stock of in developing a policy in this area?
Well, the first thing I'd say is innovation is incredibly important. It's the only thing that's in the long run going to deliver you the growth that gives you prosperity, that gets you re-elected. That should catch their attention. And think about the epidemic. Think about how we went into this without having done enough innovation in the field of vaccines. It's still taking, many years to develop a vaccine. That shouldn't be the case. We should have got vaccine platforms much more developed than they are. Ditto medical diagnostic devices. So don't underestimate the importance of this topic. Second thing, don't think that innovation is a policy lever you can pull and it will happen. I order innovation to happen. It doesn't happen that way. You've got to unleash it. You've got to let 1,000 flowers bloom, to take the Chinese phrase, and you've got to be prepared for it to go in unexpected directions. So back in the 1980s, huge amount of effort into, we must control the memory chip issue because this is going to be the strategic issue of the future. Nobody notices that integrated circuits are much more important at the time, if you like, are going to be much more important than memory chips. Memory chips become a commodity, integrated circuits don't. And software is where it turns out to be at in the future. So you've got to be prepared for the Googles and so on to come along. And that means freedom. America's terrific advantage in most of the 20th century was that although it looked from the outside like an empire, a great big country spanning a continent, in fact, it wasn't an empire. In fact, it was a very fragmented country with lots of different states, with lots of different rules, so that an innovator would say, you know what, I think I'm going to move to California because the rules are better there on tax, on capital allowances, whatever it might be, on stock share ownership rules and so on, and it's still happening. I mean, Elon Musk the other day was musing about leaving California to go to Texas because he thinks the rules are better there for innovators. And that was Europe's great advantage for most of its history too, was that innovators kept moving across national borders to find congenial regimes. And that was China's disadvantage, was that it was so unified. So I would say the more you can allow local experimentation in America, go back to doing that, because I think it has become less true in America, more federal power, less state power, the better. And fourthly, wherever I've got to anyway, just to encourage everybody to think that they've got a chance of doing it, that it isn't something that special creative people do. It's something that lots of people can achieve, and all they need to do is work hard, do trial and error, and be rewarded for it. So that's the kind of thing I'd say. But I would hope I have more than 3 minutes with President Biden or President Trump to say it. I suspect I'll have neither. Or President Harris and President Pence, it might be by then, who knows?
We can speculate. Lord Ridley, Matt, it's been a pleasure talking with you. I think you wrote a great book. We've been talking with Matt Ridley about his book, How Innovation Works and Why It Flourishes in Freedom. And we'll look forward to hearing more in the question and answer session. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Bob. It's been great fun.
Afternoon and your time, and good morning to our colleagues on the East Coast. That was a great presentation, Matt, and I just wanted to follow up with some questions from the audience, if that's okay with you.
Please do.
So the first one is a Stump the Stars question for you. What are the most important policies to promote innovation?
Well, if I knew a short answer to that question, I'd probably be doing it rather than talking about it. But in essence, the most important policies are about tackling the barriers to innovation, stripping away the barriers that are put in place by competitors, by companies that don't want to see rivals innovating in their space, by governments in the form of excess and often very slow regulation, and by pressure groups which tend to militate against or campaign against innovation, whether they mean to or not. That seems to me to be the most important set of policies, to liberate innovators to do their thing. I think that's more important than policies to stimulate innovation, which is what governments tend to prefer to do, either through subsidies or through direct spending on particular projects. For example, picking winners is something government isn't very good at, and losers picking government is often a problem. If I had one specific line that I do use when advising the UK government on innovation, it's that the government, the regulator, the problem is not that the regulator says no to things, it's that it takes a long time to say yes. In something like a nuclear power plant, it takes many, many years to get a license to operate. In a medical device, it can take several years to get a license to operate. Where that isn't true, like, for example, if you go out and invent a video game, which is permissionless, you don't need to seek anybody's permission before you invent a new video game, we see a ferment of innovation. So we've got to make innovation, we've got to make responses to innovators quicker.
Okay, that's great. Let me ask you a question related to something that David Teese said. He evidently argued that exploitation of innovation may be as important as innovation itself. What's your take on that?
I think we're living a very specific example of exactly that right now. Here we all are talking to each other remotely using video conferencing. Video conferencing technologies have been around for a number of years now. But I don't know about you, but my experience is that if you suggested to someone that instead of meeting for a cup of coffee, or instead of jumping on the phone, we should get on a face-to-face Zoom call a year ago, the response of most of my friends and contacts would be, oh, I don't know how to do Zoom. That's changed in the last year. And it hasn't changed because Zoom has got better, or Teams or any of the other products have suddenly had a technological breakthrough. It's because suddenly the demand is there to exploit the technology, and a sort of critical mass has been reached in the population of people who have access to this technology. It reminds me of what happened in the early to mid 1990s, when I was quite an early adopter of email, but I found that the only other people with email were very loquacious academics who wanted to have long arguments with each other. And I got rather bored of it, and I actually gave up an email account. And then about 6 months later, suddenly all sorts of other people in the private sector and elsewhere in the world were saying, do you have an email address? And suddenly it became worth having one. So there's a sort of demand pull for innovation as well as a supply push.
Okay, so you mentioned something about not using things like Teams and Zoom, which I'm still learning how to do. We have a question related to COVID. So are there any specific lessons in your book that might be relevant to the pandemic or whatever you call it, that we find ourselves in?
Well, the British readers of my book are fortunate because I was able to stop publication of the book in time to write a chapter about the implications of COVID. It was too late to do so for the US edition, which had already gone to print. And in that chapter, I essentially argued that there are a number of things that this epidemic teaches us. The first is that we haven't been doing enough innovation. I say that towards the end of the book, that we are in an innovation famine rather than an innovation feast, particularly if you leave aside the digital world. And we've seen this very clearly with the case of vaccines. It turns out that it takes several years to create a new vaccine, that the platforms for testing, for example, messenger RNA vaccines or other new ideas in vaccination haven't been tried out, haven't been put in a position of readiness to tackle a pandemic. That's, I think, one of the key lessons is that this pandemic is teaching us that although we've got a ton of innovations working on the pandemic on our behalf, like genetic sequencing and test and trace and things like that, they're not as good as they could be. In other words, don't mistake optimism for utopianism. Don't think that the world is already good enough. The other lesson I think that it teaches us is that we can speed up innovation when we need to, both in the case of vaccines and in the case of diagnostic devices. We are short-circuiting some of the regulatory processes to make sure technologies get available to people in fast order. And that, if we can do that in wartime, why can't we do that in peacetime? I'll use the terms metaphorically, but you understand the point. And a third point comes back to this point about using video conferencing and other technologies, which is that I think this pandemic will enable us to rethink patterns of living, patterns of commuting, patterns of travel, patterns of how we communicate with each other. And while all of us are longing to get together for, a good beer in a pub and a proper chat instead of these formal meetings on screen, for some things they are quite helpful. And just to take an example, since my book came out, I have given talks in Australia, Kenya, Ecuador, Mexico, a number of other places which I probably wouldn't have had time to fly to. And so I think those are a few of the innovation lessons that are coming out of the pandemic. But the main one is we haven't done enough of it.
So this is a question that sort of riffs off something our mutual friend and colleague Tom Hazlett asked me about when we were talking about your great book.
Great
and that
man,
is
Tom Hazlett.
So you come down a little bit hard, in my view, and maybe that's not the right word, on things like patents, particularly as they are in the real world. Do you think that patents are really important in particular industries, maybe like pharmaceuticals or things like that? Or is your view sort of across the board, whether it's IT or pharma or the chemical industry, that in practice they don't do very much for the general economic welfare?
I'm pretty skeptical of patents altogether. I think we waste too much time and money on them. I think we'd be better off if we didn't. I think unilateral disarmament in patents is probably difficult. So I'm not suggesting that we can dismantle the system overnight. But I look at the history of it and I see how much time people like Marconi and the Wright brothers wasted in court trying to defend their patents instead of getting on and using their tacit knowledge and their experience and their head start to beat the competition in a free and fair fight, which is what happens in a lot of the digital industry, the software industry. Now, the pharmaceutical case is a very interesting and difficult case, because clearly you cannot expect a drug company to spend $1 billion getting approval for a drug and then see it face immediate competition from generics. But I don't myself believe, if you examine the drug industry carefully, and I think this point was made to me by a venture capitalist, it was either Bill Gurley or Steve Jurvetson, that if you look at what the pharmaceutical industry does with its monopoly profits, it quite often defends its market share, invests it in marketing rather than necessarily in further research for new products. So I'm not sure, even in the pharmaceutical industry, that the system is working as well as it could. And there are examples of how to use a different mechanism to incentivize the discovery of new pharmaceutical products. So, for example, coming back to vaccines again, vaccines are not generally very profitable through the patent system because they're either so effective that they do themselves out of a job, or they're needed by people in poor parts of the world who can't afford them, and so you can't charge high prices for them. So a lot of the pharmaceutical industry hasn't gone off chasing vaccines, and that's one of the reasons we haven't got enough. Now, the Gates Foundation and the Wellcome Trust have set up something called the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness Innovation, and they did this in 2017. It hasn't, unfortunately, had time to have an impact on this pandemic, but let's hope it does on a future one, because they're talking about things like advanced market commitments, which are essentially a form of prize. that you dangle in front of a pharmaceutical company to say, if you invent a vaccine that, for example, deals with pneumococcus, a killer of children in the developing world, then we will top up the price that you can charge. And that will incentivize you to go out and do so. But it doesn't mean that we have to give you a monopoly, and it doesn't mean that we have to decide which company has the right solution right at the beginning. We can give it at the end when you've invented it, essentially. Now, that specific example has worked very well. Several companies have come forward with vaccines for pneumococcus. They've been well rewarded, slightly too well rewarded. The calculation was that ended up being very generous to the companies. The Gates Foundation paid for it. But my argument there is that even in the case of the pharmaceutical industry, I can see us thinking of more flexible and different ways of rewarding innovators rather than through the patent system, which ends up stifling innovation in far too many cases.
Okay, I think we've got time for one more question, even though we have a long list. Evidently, there's an excess demand or excess interest in your book here that we won't have time to fulfill. And the question relates to the large tech companies, what are sometimes euphemistically referred to as GAFAM. The question is, do you think that regulation of the type that different countries are considering, or reports that have come out of different countries like the UK and the US and the EU, is likely to, they say, hinder innovation, but I would say do more harm than good?
I think it's a really difficult question. You can see how we are in a situation where self-regulation is no longer working. We've essentially said to Facebook and Twitter, please don't spread the wrong information. And they've said, right, well, we don't know how to decide what's right and what's wrong, so we're going to outsource that to pressure groups. And therefore the pressure groups are piling in, and you're getting, as it were, unbalanced censorship through these social media platforms. That doesn't seem an equitable outcome. And now we're hearing threats to repeal Section 230 of the Digital Millennium Copyright Act in the US, which would essentially make them into publishers. And then they would be even more like newspapers. They would decide what they wanted to publish and what they didn't. They would become even stricter censors on what they pass on. So that isn't a terribly good solution. And some of the attacks on big tech that have happened in Europe have played into the hands of big companies. There's no question that GDPR, this General Data Protection Regulation, which came in a couple of years ago, which causes you to have to click on I accept cookies and that sort of thing when you go on a new website, has helped the big companies at the expense of the small companies. You know, on the whole, advertising revenue has shifted towards big firms in Europe. You can see that empirically. And the reason for that is because the kind of legal and administrative infrastructure you've got to have to be compliant with GDPR is tougher on small companies than it is on big companies. So I very much fear that as we set out to regulate these dominant semi-monopolies in the digital arena, we will end up doing as much harm as good, perhaps even more, and that is a problem. That isn't to say that we shouldn't try and do something. What we know works in this space, of course, in all these areas, is to get competition going. You know, let there be social media platforms that censor right-wing speech, and let there be other ones that censor left-wing speech, and let there be ones that censor neither, and so on. And I just wish we could find a way, and antitrust may be the way to do it, to see more competition in the provision of some of these services.
Matt, this is great. I want to thank you for kicking off Virtual Aspen, and I hope we have a chance to talk with you in real Aspen in future sessions. And I hope you continue to provide the public with a great service by writing these fantastic books. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Bob. It's been a real pleasure, and thanks for having me on, and good luck to you. And yes, a beer in a real Aspen one day is definitely on the cards.